Bricks and Minifigs is your one-stop shop for all things LEGO. Hit the link below to find a store near you.
Matthew Green. The layout is the Battle of Kursk. Almost 80 years ago, started July the 5th, between the Germans and the Russians on the Eastern Front. It was Germany's last strategic attack. From that point on, after this battle, they were on the defensive. Russians were always pushing them back toward Berlin.
So how did you decide to create this layout kind of based on this battle out of LEGO here?
We had done one on Pearl Harbor several years ago, and it was well received. And the only way you could do this kind of a battle was micro scale. So this is just one city that they're fighting over. The battle itself was huge, largest tank battle ever. Russians had somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 tanks, and the Germans had like 10,000. It was crazy numbers. But the Germans were trying to cut off a salient in the Russian lines and trap a huge army and try to turn the tide in the battle in the war.
So there's a lot happening here. Take us through kind of each side then, a little bit of the vehicles and tanks you have represented here and what's kind of the layout of the whole build.
Okay, the city of, it starts with a P and I can't pronounce the name of it, a Russian name, but the city was the linchpin for the whole thing. The Russians had built several lines of fortifications. In this build, the Germans have broken through the first line of the fortifications. We're coming up on the town, and then the third line of the fortifications is represented by a green hill with a red flag in the middle of it. A rail line and a river ran through. This was the linchpin for the whole line because this is the only place they could cross. The river was on the railroad bridge or at the ford just out from the little village. But the Germans were fighting with mostly Panther and Tigers. The Ferdinand tank was also present on the battlefield. The airplanes are Stukas, medium bombers, 109s, and 190s were the fighters. The Russians had fighters and medium bombers themselves, but the Russians had a lot of artillery, maybe 30,000 pieces of artillery that they were fighting, and they also had cartouches, which were their trucks that carried rockets. And that's represented by the swarm of rockets that's headed toward the Germans.
So a big variety of kind of equipment, both on the ground and the air, represented in this battle.
Exactly. Tried to get representation of all the pieces that were present. Somewhere there's a KV-1, which is the large Russian tank, out on the build also.
So when you were going for this layout, how did you decide on kind of this scale and the size of the tanks and buildings and everything as you were putting this all together?
Built the tanks as small as I could build them and still be recognizable, and then built up from that as a scale.
And talk a little bit more about the buildings here and kind of what each of those represent and the layout of the town.
Okay, the layout of the town, the key point in the town was the watchtower, wooden watchtower that was built that the Russians used as an observation point. Next to the watchtower is a train station. Across from the train station is City Hall. There's also a warehouse and a train loading depot next to the train tracks. Rest of it is mostly just towns and villages of really a pretty small village.
So with this scale, I know you started with the tanks, you said. How do you decide on kind of landscaping then and how the size of that? How does that come together in terms of keeping it all within the right scale and making sure things don't look kind of too big or too small?
I started off with the topographical map from Russia. Got a topographical map, and it was able to give me an idea of where the flow of things happened. And then it's just you layer bricks on top of bricks until you get it to look right. No real plans. Okay. That is the plan for the build. So as you can see, it's pretty sketched.
Just kind of figure it out as you start putting the bricks down.
Right. And you do things like how would you build a railroad bridge? And then that becomes the scale of how the tracks have to be. I didn't put a locomotive on the tracks because I couldn't get a locomotive to fit the right scale with Lego pieces. It would have been way too big to show any kind of detail.
Yeah. And you've got a lot of trees on the layout, so what types of pieces did you use for those, and what kind of variety of trees do you have here?
I have dark green, light green, and sage-colored trees. I mean, they're basically the small leaf piece clustered together, and they're on 1x3, 1x4 bar pieces.
And then some of this is kind of more destroyed over here in this section.
Right. As you come from left to right on the build, it's where the Russians have come. So you've got a heavy artillery bombardment in front of the first lines. The first lines are wrecked. As you come across, you've got the trees are burned or have had the leaves blown off of them. And then as you get into the right section, which is the section the Germans have not yet gotten to, you've got full built-out trees. The ground's not pocked by artillery, by an artillery barrage, etc.
I love your technique here in the field. So how did you achieve that? What pieces did you use to create this technique?
Well, they go down into the bricks are studs down, so you can place the Technic pins, half Technic pins, in the opening for the stud, and then where tanks have gone, it's been mashed down to the ground to use 1x1 rounds.
Yeah, that works so well. And then how did you represent the people throughout the build here?
The helmets are either dark gray or light gray. The colors of the bodies are the uniform colors that they use. The Germans use more of a gray, and the Russians use more of a brown caramel color. And then the bottom stud was their boots.
And yeah, that works very well. So as we keep moving down kind of towards the German lines you were talking about and the advancing Germans here, we see a lot of that destruction. So how did you do that smoke and kind of creating that fire effect?
Used headlight bricks and 1x1s with studs all around, and then trans gray, I don't know what they're called, sloped bricks.
Like a windshield type piece almost.
Exactly, to give it sort of a billowing effect. And then use brown leaves and black and brown for the trees to show they've been burnt or the leaves have been blown off of them.
And then building at this small scale with the tanks, obviously you have to get really creative with kind of the pieces that you're using to achieve the look of all these different vehicles. So what pieces do you find work well for things like tracks and turrets and stuff? Were you able to kind of find...
Technic beams do the tracks really well. And you can get 3, 4, 5s, 7s, 8s, depending on how big the tank is you're doing. Or if you're doing a half track, you're going to use the 3. And then the bars are the cannons, work the best. I don't know what it's called, but the bracket that's a back that you put on the back of a minifig normally does the exhausts well, coming out of the Panthers and Tigers.
Yeah, you can see kind of achieving the iconic look a lot of these vehicles here. In the far corner we have, is that like a hospital setup? What's happening over there?
Hospital. That's where the Germans are taking their wounded in. They pretty much did not take the Russian wounded in.
And what was your research process like? I know you said you had some sketches over there. Were you kind of looking at photos from the battle or reading a lot? What was that process like as you were working on this?
Yeah, a lot of research. There's a good book that's put out by Classic Editions, Classic Battles, Kursk 1943. There are several online sites that you can get more information on the battle, and then a lot of black and white photographs, not much in color.
And I also like you did kind of the lettering up front here, and so that's just when someone first walks up to it, kind of gives them an idea of what they're looking at.
Exactly. And it sort of was nice that it coincided with when Brick Rodeo normally holds their shows, is right around July the 4th. So, we are close to or during the anniversary of the battle.
Yeah. No, that timing works really well. So then you can see this whole thing is kind of built up under there. Does that get really parts intensive to kind of raise this all up and build up the core underneath there?
It is parts intensive, but if you've been building for 40 years, you've got a pretty good supply of 2x4 bricks that you can put underneath it.
Yeah, you've really built up a nice collection at this point, I'm sure.
There you go. We won't talk about that. My wife might see this.
So then bringing this to the show, what was that process like and kind of setting this all up for you?
Trees generally come off in the transport, but they're in the box that they came in. Each build on large gray base plates, so it's 15 by 15. They go down into a 16 by 16 inch box, and then I use 3/4 inch house insulation to snug up the sides, and that they travel pretty well. Most things stay together except for the trees, and then of course the tanks and the airplanes and things are all added on site.
And with a layout like this, what is the public reaction typically like? I know you've done some military builds in the past as well. What is that like with kids and adults as they come by and start to check out this display and see what it's all about?
Getting a lot of interest. It's not a battle that a lot of the kids have heard about because it's an Eastern Front battle as opposed to Pearl Harbor, which was immediately recognizable. But showing them the book, and that's something that's probably in their school libraries or their local library, is also helpful to help them learn a little bit more about history.
Yeah. Well, I think that's super cool. So it's educational and just really impressive building layout here. Thanks so much for taking us through all the details. I appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks, guys.